My father left my brother an entire mineral empire, while I received only an abandoned farm in the barren Rocky Mountains. In the room where the will was read that day, my brother burst into laughter, saying I was foolish, pitiful, that after caring for our father for a year, my reward was nothing but a pile of worthless, weed-covered rubble. I remained silent. But when the lawyer opened the second envelope, the room fell into a stifling silence. It turned out that the pile of rubble concealed a mineral deposit worth tens of millions of dollars, a legacy my father had left solely for me as his final message. Never underestimate the value of what seems insignificant. From that day forward, the balance of power in the Hartwell family was completely overturned. Hello, my name is Owen Hartwell. I'm 32 years old. I live in a small log cabin nestled in the Arkansas River Valley, in the peaceful town of Buena Vista, Colorado, a place as serene as a painting. Every morning I wake up as the first light of dawn peeks over the collegiate peaks, their snow-capped summits glimmering like jewels in the early sunlight. The air here is crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth, a smell that lightens my heart as if all my troubles dissolve with the breeze. I chose this place to live to escape the noise and pressure that once clung to me in Denver. And if I'm being honest, I've never regretted that decision. I work at a campground near Cottonwood Lake. My tasks are simple: checking trails, repairing fences, cleaning up litter after the weekends. The work is quiet, accompanied only by the sound of the wind, the water, and sometimes the distant laughter of children from the other side of the lake. I love that feeling, doing small things amidst the vastness of nature, letting my mind rest unburdened by the past. I don't have many friends, nor do I care for parties. After work, I return to my cabin, tending to the small garden out back where I grow a few rows of vegetables and a cluster of flowers my mother once loved. As the sun sets, I often sit on the porch watching the fiery red sunset blanket the mountains, painting the valley in warm shades of orange. Those are the moments I feel truly alive, truly at home in this place, where simplicity is all I need. 10 years ago, I lived in Denver with my family in a grand house in Cherry Creek, one of the city's most affluent neighborhoods. Back then, I worked for Hartwell Minerals Incorporated, our family's mining company. My father, Walter Hartwell, was the chairman and CEO, a man revered across Colorado for his determination and vision. He was an extraordinary man. Starting from nothing, he was a mining engineer who worked tirelessly to build Hartwell Minerals into one of Colorado's largest mining conglomerates. At 63, he still went to work every day, personally reviewing reports, signing contracts, and attending strategic meetings. His employees respected him, not just for his talent, but for his discipline and foresight. In the mining industry, the name Walter Hartwell was almost legendary. A man who never bowed to adversity, always maintaining a calm demeanor, whether facing partners or rivals. But to me, he was a stern, reserved father who kept his distance. He wasn't the type to pat his son on the shoulder or offer warm words of encouragement. His affection was in his quiet glances, in the nod he gave when I completed a task, or in the way he kept a faded family photo on his desk, never moving it, as if doing so would mean losing a piece of his past. That photo was the one thing he never touched, a silent anchor to the life he'd lived. I worked at Hartwell Minerals for 2 years and felt it wasn't for me. The endless meetings, the calculated handshakes, the cold, sharp glances in the boardroom, it all suffocated me. I didn't belong in the world of million-dollar deals or mining contracts. When I was 24, everything fell apart. My mother passed away after a long battle with illness, and the house in Cherry Creek, once filled with laughter, became cold and stifling. Every corner of that house reminded me of her. Her gentle smile, her warm voice, her silhouette by the window, quietly knitting sweaters for me and my brother. My father, a man as unyielding as granite, couldn't withstand that loss. He didn't cry, but I saw him age with each passing day. His eyes, once sharp as a blade, were now clouded with a veil of sorrow. Not long after, he left that grand house and moved to a villa in Evergreen, where he and my mother used to spend weekends. The house sat by Evergreen Lake, with windows overlooking the shimmering water and pines swaying in the breeze. He said that place made him feel closer to her. But I knew no place could ease the loneliness in his heart. As for me, I left too. I left that house, left Denver. I needed a place where the past wouldn't haunt me every morning when I opened my eyes. My life now revolves around quiet days in Buena Vista. In the evenings, I sit in my small living room reading technical manuals or repairing my mother's old belongings. A pendulum clock, a wooden music box, or sometimes the rocking chair she used to sit in. Those items aren't just objects. They're a connection to her. To the days when I was a boy running around the house, listening to her stories about the Colorado mountains. Every time I touch them, I hear her voice again. Gentle, warm, reminding me that no matter how the world changes, her love remains untouched. Every weekend, I drive my old pickup truck from Buena Vista to Evergreen to visit my father. The trip takes over 2 hours, winding through twisting roads where mountains and meadows stretch endlessly. I usually bring a loaf of freshly baked bread, the kind he likes, with a crisp crust and the rich aroma of butter, along with some repair tools. He never asks, but I know he likes to check everything in the house himself, from the generator to the heating system. At his age, though, he's not as strong as he used to be. When I arrive, we don't talk much. A nod, a brief greeting, then we each go about our tasks. I check the generator, clean the yard, trim the grass, while he sits in his spacious study where the desk lamp casts light on old geological maps and stacks of files. Sometimes I catch him looking out the window, his gaze lingering on me in the yard. When we're done, we sit on the porch, each with a cup of hot tea, watching Evergreen Lake glimmer in the fading light. In those moments, time seems to stand still. The wind blows through the pines, carrying the sharp chill of the mountains, but the tea in my hands feels oddly warm. We exchange a few casual words about the weather, my work at the campground, or his health. He asks if I'm tired, if I need anything, but I just shake my head and smile faintly. I know he's not one for grand gestures, and I don't need him to be. Our dinners are simple, usually grilled meat, potatoes, and some vegetables from the garden. My father isn't fussy, but he eats slowly, as if savoring the moment. Once he told me about the early days of building Hartwell Minerals, when he was a young engineer working 16-hour days in the mines. I listened quietly, feeling the pride in his voice and the loneliness he never admitted. When night falls, I prepare to leave. He stands on the porch, arms crossed, watching my truck disappear behind the pines. I don't look back, but in the rearview mirror I see his figure. Small, quiet, but as steadfast as the mountain behind him. We don't share many words, but there's an invisible bond between us, stronger than any language. I didn't know that in those peaceful days a storm was quietly brewing. My father, the man who seemed unshakable, was standing at the edge of fate. And I, the son living quietly in his shadow, was about to face the greatest challenge of my life. A challenge that would not only change my world, but also lay bare the hidden corners of our family, our bonds, and my own heart. I drove back to Buena Vista, my headlights cutting through the dark road, a heavy sense of unease settling in my chest. Something was waiting for me up ahead, but I couldn't name it yet. All I knew was that, in the quiet of Colorado's mountains, fate had begun to weave a story I never could have imagined. The days that followed passed as usual, but that sense of unease never left me. Each time I visited my father in Evergreen, I noticed he wasn't the same. His eyes, though still sharp, often drifted somewhere distant, as if lost in far-off memories. He was thinner, his steps slower, and when we sat by the lake he would sigh, deep, heavy sighs I'd never heard before. I asked if he was okay, but he only nodded, his voice firm. "I'm fine. Don't worry." I knew he was hiding something, but with my father, forcing him to open up was impossible. One afternoon in early March, while I was walking around the campground, my phone buzzed. It was an unfamiliar number, a Denver area code. I answered with a hint of curiosity. The urgent voice on the other end was Ellen, my father's personal secretary. "Owen, you need to get to the hospital now. Mr. Walter, he collapsed during a meeting. They're taking him to Denver Health." My heart stopped. I didn't ask for details, just dropped my tools, shouted to a coworker that I had to go, and rushed to my truck. The drive from Buena Vista to Denver was over 100 miles, but I don't remember how I got there. My mind was blank, filled only with the image of my father, the man who always stood tall like a mountain, now collapsed, helpless. I floored the gas pedal, speeding through winding mountain roads, my headlights flickering across snow-covered pines. The unease that had haunted me turned into fear, clawing at my chest. I told myself he'd be fine, that he was just tired, that he'd get back up like he always did. But deep down, I knew something had changed. When I reached the hospital, the hallways were stark white under fluorescent lights. The sharp smell of antiseptic made me dizzy. Ellen was waiting at the reception desk, her face pale, her hands trembling. "He's in the ER," she said, her voice choking. "The doctors say he has chronic myocardial ischemia with early-stage heart failure. They also found he's had high blood pressure for a long time, but he never told anyone." I stood frozen. My father, the man who never admitted weakness, had been hiding his illness for how long? The chest pains, the times he quietly took pills. It all flashed through my mind like a painful reel. I signed the surgery papers, completed the formalities, and sat outside the ER. Time seemed to stop. Each tick of the clock on the wall felt like a knife to my heart. I thought of our evenings in Evergreen when he sat in his study, the desk lamp casting light on the old family photo. I thought of my mother who had left us, and now I feared losing another. I clenched my fists, praying silently, though I'm not a religious man. Finally, the doctor emerged, his face weary but calm. "He's stable, but it's serious. He needs complete rest, no stress. Even a single strong episode could cause his heart to stop at any moment." The doctor's words sank into me like nails. Complete rest? For my father, that was unthinkable. He lived for the company, for geological maps and mining contracts. How could I convince him to stop? I called my brother Miles right after. Miles was my father's pride. At 36, he was sharp, intelligent, with a knack for finance. 3 years ago, my father entrusted him with the investment branch of Hartwell Minerals in New York. To my father, Miles was the ideal heir, born to lead, to take the company to new heights. To him, I was just a kind son, but lacking ambition. I never resented him for it. Miles and I were as different as day and night. He thrived in the world of Wall Street skyscrapers, lavish parties, and million-dollar handshakes. I chose Buena Vista, the quiet of the mountains. Miles answered after a few rings, his voice cold, distracted. "Owen, what's going on?" I told him everything, trying to keep my voice steady. "Dad's in the hospital. You need to come back now." On the other end, I heard a sigh. "I'll try to sort things out. Work here's a mess. I'll fly back as soon as I can." I hung up, a weight like a stone pressing on my chest. For the next few days, I practically lived at the hospital. I stayed by my father's side, tending to his meals, his medications. He was visibly weaker, but he still tried to maintain his tough facade. "Don't worry," he said, his voice hoarse. "I'm not going to die that easily." I smiled, but my heart ached. I cooked soup, reminded him to take his pills, and sat by him through the nights when he coughed or stirred restlessly. In those moments, I saw not the iron-willed man of Hartwell Minerals, but an aging father who needed me more than ever. Miles arrived on the 3rd day after my father had passed the critical stage. He walked into the room in a sharp black suit, looking tired. He gave me a brief hug, asked a few questions about Dad's condition, then sat down, checking his phone. "I can only stay a few hours," he said. "Work in New York can't wait." I nodded, saying nothing. I knew he wouldn't stay long. For Miles, the company was the priority, and our father. though he'd never say it, was just a duty to fulfill. Dad was discharged after a week. The doctors ordered absolute rest, no work. I brought him back to the villa in Evergreen where the shimmering lake seemed to whisper the peace he needed. Miles suggested hiring a nurse and a caregiver, but Dad dismissed it immediately. "I don't need strangers in my house," he said firmly. "I don't want anyone seeing me like this." I understood. My father had spent his life giving orders, maintaining his dignity. Weakness was something he could never accept, even in himself. Miles took that as his cue to leave. "Owen, you're nearby. Take care of Dad. I'll support from afar." He said it, then flew back to New York that same evening. I didn't argue, not because I agreed, but because I knew arguing with Miles was pointless. I moved to Evergreen, bringing only a few clothes. From then on, I became my father's caregiver, cooking, reminding him to take his meds, helping him get around. Sometimes he'd grip my hand lightly, saying nothing. I knew that was his way of saying thank you. Those days left me exhausted. I worried about my father, his health, and the fear that if I collapsed, he'd have no one left. Miles called occasionally, asking cursory questions, sometimes stopping by for a few hours before leaving again. I didn't blame him, but I felt the distance between us growing wider. Our father was the last bridge between us, and now, as he lay frail in his bed, I wondered if that bond was strong enough to hold us together. The weeks that followed felt like I was a shadow in the Evergreen villa. Each day I woke at dawn, brewed tea for my father, and prepared a simple breakfast, usually oatmeal with a touch of honey, something he liked but rarely admitted. I helped him with his medication, supported him as he walked to the porch to gaze at the lake, though sometimes he just sat there, his eyes tinged with sadness, staring far off toward the mountains. I tried to make everything gentle so he wouldn't feel like a burden, but deep down I knew he hated depending on me. One winter morning when snow blanketed Evergreen, I woke earlier than usual. The air in the house was freezing, my breath forming faint wisps in the cold. I went downstairs to prepare breakfast, but the house was unnervingly silent. No soft cough from my father, no sound of him stirring in bed, not even the steady tick of the pendulum clock. A chilling premonition ran down my spine. I hurried up the stairs, my heart pounding, trying to push away the thoughts screaming in my head. The door to my father's room was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The dim light from the window fell on his face, eerily peaceful. He lay there motionless, his right hand resting on the old family photo, the one of the four of us, when my mother was still alive, when everything was still whole. I stood frozen, barely daring to breathe. "Dad," I called softly, but only the clock's ticking answered. I knelt beside the bed, taking his hand. It was cold. I gripped it tightly as if I could pull him back, but I knew he was gone. My father, the man who seemed invincible, had left me in his sleep as quietly as he'd lived his final days. I sat there beside him for how long I don't know. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't in pain, but because the pain was too vast, too deep for me to know how to express it. The room was still, the cold from the window seeping into my skin. I called Miles. The phone rang a few times before he picked up. "Owen, what's up this early?" His voice was flat. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my tone steady. "Dad's gone, Miles." There was a long silence on the other end. Then he said, his voice eerily calm, "I'll come back as soon as I can." I hung up without waiting for more. He always had a reason, work, family, or something else to keep him in New York. After the call, I felt hollow. No one was by my side, no more of my father's voice calling my name, no more of his gaze watching me from the window. I knew this wasn't the time to break down. My father needed me to handle everything properly. I contacted the hospital, the funeral home, and then called Ellen, my father's secretary, to break the news. I reached out to a few of his old friends, those who had built Hartwell Minerals with him from the ground up. Each call was a stab to my heart, but I had to do it. I was Owen Hartwell, the quiet son, and now I was the only one left to take care of my father one last time. On the day of the funeral, Evergreen was draped in a blanket of snow. The small cemetery sat on the edge of town, where rows of pines stood like silent sentinels. Townsfolk, Hartwell Minerals employees, and my father's old friends came in droves. They gathered in groups dressed in black, whispering about the years my father built the company, how he turned a dream into reality. Walter Hartwell was a symbol of the pioneer generation. An elderly man, once an engineer under my father, told me, "You should be proud." I nodded, but inside I felt only emptiness. Proud? Maybe. But I just wanted my father here, sitting on the porch, sipping tea and watching the lake. Amid the sea of black-clad mourners, I quietly greeted each person, shaking hands, thanking them for coming. Miles still hadn't shown up. I tried not to think about him, focusing instead on the condolences. He was the one my father trusted, chosen to lead Hartwell Minerals. But now, as my father lay in a cold coffin, where was he? Just as the burial ceremony was about to begin, a sleek black car pulled up to the cemetery. Miles stepped out, his black suit immaculate, but his face weary, his eyes cold. He walked straight to the casket, bowed his head, then turned to me. "Sorry, Owen. Urgent business delayed me. I missed my flight." His voice was flat, like he was explaining to a business partner. I stood still, not looking at him, not responding. About a week after the funeral, Miles and I were summoned to a lawyer's office in downtown Denver to hear the reading of the will. The small, quiet room held just me, Miles, and my father's trusted lawyer, Graham Porter, who had worked with him for over 20 years. Graham sat across from us, his face solemn. He opened a sealed envelope, pulled out the will, and began reading. His voice was low, clear, but each word struck me like a hammer. "All shares and operational control of Hartwell Minerals, along with related investments and properties, are transferred to Miles Hartwell," Graham read. "The sole condition is that the company must continue operating for at least 5 years and cannot be sold or merged." Miles sat up straighter, a confident glint in his eyes. He nodded as if it was all expected. I lowered my head, silent. I always knew my father would choose Miles. Graham paused, glanced at me, then continued, "To Owen Hartwell, I bequeath Hartwell Ridge, along with the log cabin on it, located in western Fremont County near the Royal Gorge area." I froze. Hartwell Ridge, the desolate land my father took me to when I was a kid, a place of wind, rocks, and weeds. I couldn't understand why he'd left it to me. An abandoned farm, worthless except for faded memories. Miles let out a soft laugh, the sound cutting through the silent room. He leaned back, arms crossed, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Well, that's fair. You took care of Dad for a whole year and you get a barren patch of dirt. Poor Owen, trying so hard to be the good son, only to end up with the scraps left behind the real legacy." I sat still, my hand lightly gripping the armrest, listening to my brother's smug laughter, as if he'd won a game that was rigged from the start. Then the atmosphere in the room shifted as Graham cleared his throat and continued. "Approximately 10 years ago, Walter Hartwell signed a contract granting Silver Rock Mining Corporation exploration rights on Hartwell Ridge. Recently, they discovered a deposit of rare minerals in the land. The company has offered to purchase full mining rights for $75 million, along with annual royalties for the next 15 years valued at tens of millions." The room fell silent. I felt the blood rush to my ears, my mind reeling. $75 million? Rare minerals? I had no idea my father had done anything with that land. I glanced at Miles. His face was frozen, his eyes flashing with a mix of shock and envy. He clenched his fists, trying to maintain his composure, but I saw his fingers tremble slightly. Graham closed the file and looked at us. "That's the entirety of the will. If you have any questions, you may ask me." I left the office in a daze. Miles walked beside me, silent, but I could feel the tension radiating from him. As we stepped onto the Denver sidewalk, the winter sunlight glaring off the pavement, I felt only cold. Hartwell Ridge, the land I thought was worthless, was a treasure. and my father, the man I thought I knew, had left me a message I couldn't yet fully decipher. True value lies beyond what first meets the eye. A few weeks later, as I sat in my log cabin brewing coffee and gazing at the collegiate peaks, my phone rang. A polite voice came through. "Mr. Owen Hartwell? This is Daniel Brooks, a representative from Silver Rock Mining Corporation. We'd like to discuss Hartwell Ridge." My heart raced. I invited him to Buena Vista, and 2 days later, Mr. Brooks sat across from me in my small living room, a thick stack of documents in front of me. He explained that the rare mineral deposits found beneath Hartwell Ridge were immensely valuable. Silver Rock was prepared to pay $75 million for the mining rights, along with annual royalties for the next 15 years. I listened as if in a dream. $75 million? Me, a maintenance worker living in a log cabin about to become a millionaire? I asked questions repeatedly, poring over every line of the contract, afraid I'd misunderstood. Mr. Brooks patiently clarified, and I realized this was no joke. My father had known about this land, had quietly signed an exploration contract 10 years earlier. He never told me, but he'd left me a treasure. Not just money, but an opportunity to change my life. I thought long and hard, lying back in my mother's old rocking chair, staring at the ceiling, wondering what my father would want me to do. Sign the contract, keep the land, or something else. In the end, I decided to sign. Not because I craved wealth, but because I wanted to use the money for something meaningful, something my parents would be proud of. After a few weeks of finalizing the legalities, the contract was signed. One morning, I checked my bank account and saw the staggering figure: $75 million. I sat there, hands trembling, unable to believe this was real. Strangely, my life didn't change overnight. I stayed in my log cabin, drove my old pickup truck, and brewed my coffee each morning to watch the mountains. My co-workers teased me, asking why I didn't buy a new car or a bigger house. I just smiled and said I wasn't ready. Truthfully, I was afraid. I feared that money would consume me, turn me into someone I wouldn't recognize. I wanted to hold on to the simplicity that kept me close to my parents. Gradually, I learned to manage the wealth. I opened investment accounts and hired a financial advisor, but I didn't let myself get lost in the world of numbers. Instead, I founded the Hartwell Foundation, a fund to support vocational education for underprivileged youth in Colorado's mountain regions. I named it after my parents, a way to keep them alive through good deeds. I remembered my father once saying, "Money isn't the goal, it's a tool." I wanted to use that tool to make a difference, to give kids growing up in poverty a chance to learn a trade and stand on their own. I also returned to Hartwell Ridge. The land, once barren and covered in weeds and old geological survey markers, now appeared to me in a new light. I hired a team of architects and engineers to transform the old cabin into a small eco-lodge, blending nature conservation with community tourism. I wanted the place to be more than just a site my father had explored for minerals, a destination that brought jobs and hope to the local people. Standing in the valley, watching local workers laugh and talk as they built wooden frames and replanted pines around the lodge, I felt a quiet pride swell in my chest. This was my father's legacy, and I was turning it into something vibrant and humane, something he would surely be proud of. Meanwhile, in Denver, Miles officially took over Hartwell Minerals Incorporated. I heard the news from Ellen, my father's former secretary. He restructured the management, cut staff, and shifted the mining strategy. He announced plans to usher the company into a modern era with ambitious expansion goals. I wasn't surprised. Miles was always a man of big dreams, eager to prove he was better than our father. But I was worried. Just a few months later, rumors began to spread. Several old mining contracts stalled due to missed renewals. An expansion project in Nevada was halted for environmental violations. I read in the news that Hartwell Minerals stock was plummeting. Ellen called me, her voice anxious. "Miles is making a mess of everything, Owen. Veteran employees are quitting in droves. They say he's too arrogant, too hasty." My heart sank as I listened. I knew Miles was smart, but his arrogance could destroy it all. I didn't reach out to Miles and he didn't call me. But I heard the company was drowning in debt. A massive bank loan from my father's expansion days remained unpaid. Major shareholders were pulling out, draining cash flow. The media began questioning Miles's leadership. The promising heir was now called a failure. I took no pleasure in hearing this, but I wasn't surprised. Miles had chosen his path, and now he was paying the price. Those days I was consumed with Hartwell Ridge. The Eco Lodge was taking shape, with new wooden cabins rising amid green fields where local workers labored with bright smiles. The Hartwell Foundation was also up and running, awarding its first scholarships to underprivileged youth in the mountain regions. Each time I saw their eyes light up upon receiving acceptance letters for vocational training, I saw my father again, the man who believed honest work was the only way to stand tall. But despite my busy days, I couldn't stop thinking about Hartwell Minerals, my father's legacy, and Miles, who was letting it slip away. One late afternoon, as I checked the irrigation system at Hartwell Ridge, I heard a car horn in the distance. A sleek black car pulled up to the farm's gate. I squinted, trying to make out the figure stepping out. Miles. He wore a wrinkled suit, his face gaunt, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, as if he hadn't slept in days. Gone was the smug confidence of the brother who once stood atop Wall Street. He walked toward me, his leather shoes caked with red dirt, and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen. Fear, desperation, and a hint of pleading. "Owen," he said, his voice hoarse, "I need to talk to you." I nodded and led him to the small log cabin at the edge of the farm. I brewed coffee, placing a steaming mug in front of him, but he just stared at it, untouched. "The company's collapsing," he said bluntly. "I've tried everything, but I can't do it alone. I need your help." His words cut like a knife, not out of bitterness, but because of the raw truth in them. This wasn't just a plea for Hartwell Minerals, it was for our father's legacy, the one he'd sacrificed his life to build. I looked at him, searching for the brother who'd mocked me when I inherited Hartwell Ridge. I no longer trusted him, not after the times he'd abandoned our father, abandoned me. But then I thought of Dad, of the nights he sat in his study, the desk lamp illuminating the old family photo. I thought of Hartwell Minerals, of the hundreds of employees facing job loss, of my father's reputation being buried by Miles's mistakes. I knew I couldn't turn away, not for Miles, but for Dad. "All right," I said calmly, "but I need to see all the financial records, contracts, and personnel structure. I'm not pouring money in blindly." Miles nodded, a flicker of relief in his eyes, though I could sense his tension, as if he feared I'd uncover something. I said nothing more. The following week I went to Denver, bringing a team of accountants and lawyers I'd hired. We sat in our father's old office, still heavy with the scent of walnut wood and aged paper. I pored over every page of financial reports, contracts, and memos. What I found chilled me. Reckless spending, prolonged overseas projects, hemorrhaging money, and stalled mining contracts due to mismanagement. Miles had tried to modernize the company, but his haste and arrogance had dug a bottomless pit. Instead of throwing money at the problem, I began restructuring. I used part of my wealth to buy back 40% of the shares from withdrawing investors, making me the second largest shareholder after Miles. I faced the board and persuaded them with a detailed plan. Return Hartwell Minerals to its core, domestic mining and mineral processing where we were strongest. I rehired veteran engineers who had worked under my father, those who'd left because they couldn't tolerate Miles. I removed opportunists, those who flattered but lacked competence. I established a transparent financial system, making every contract and expense public. Banks once hesitant began returning as they saw the changes. I created a sustainable mining division, partnering with environmental organizations to restore the company's reputation. In the early stages, Miles cooperated. He handled external relations, renegotiating with old partners while I managed internal operations and finances. We worked together, saying little, but I felt a fragile connection forming, not through apologies, but through shared responsibility. After nearly a year, the changes bore fruit. Domestic mines resumed operations with safe, efficient processes thanks to modern monitoring technology I'd invested in. Loss-making overseas projects were cleanly liquidated, slashing tens of millions in bad debt. Banks offered partnerships and investors returned. Within 18 months, Hartwell Minerals not only survived the crisis but grew 35% beyond its peak under my father. I launched a line of refined materials from clean minerals, opening new markets in green construction and renewable energy. The state of Colorado commended us for our environmental efforts, something unheard of under Miles's leadership. The media took notice. The Denver Post and Colorado Business Review hailed Hartwell Minerals as a reborn icon of mountain mining. In a year-end financial report, the company posted record profits, expanded hiring, and restored benefits for hundreds of employees. My face appeared in business magazines dubbed the Quiet Heir who saved Hartwell Minerals from the brink. The stock price doubled, placing the company back among Colorado's leaders. At first, Miles seemed pleased. He shook my hand at meetings, smiled for the press, and spoke of the Hartwell brothers' unity. But I began to notice a shift in his eyes. Shareholders approached me for strategy discussions, and the media mentioned my name in every article. Miles grew quiet, but I sensed a growing bitterness in him. The gap between us, which I thought had narrowed, began to widen again. I didn't see the subtle wariness in him. To me, saving Hartwell Minerals was what my father wanted most. I believed the past, Miles abandoning our father, his mocking words, could be forgiven. I believed that despite our differences, we were still brothers, bound by Hartwell blood. But I was wrong. Another storm was quietly brewing. Not from the outside, but from the heart of the brother I'd hoped would change. As Hartwell Minerals entered a period of dazzling growth, the entire state of Colorado seemed to come alive. Award ceremonies were held, gleaming medals were presented, and the press clamored for interviews. In public, Miles and I appeared as symbols of unity, the Hartwell brothers together reviving our father's legacy. We shook hands for the cameras, smiled at press conferences, but I began to notice that Miles's smile was no longer genuine. Behind the spotlight, a new conflict was quietly brewing. Miles, as chairman, began to steer the narrative. In interviews, he spoke of his strategic vision, his leadership during the crisis, and the legacy our father entrusted to him. I heard those words on the TV while sitting in my Buena Vista cabin, a chill running down my spine. My name, once hailed as the savior of the company, was gradually erased from articles. I was relegated to strategic advisor or investor. Some papers even suggested that Hartwell Minerals' success stemmed from Miles's bold decisions in restructuring. My team, the veteran engineers and employees who worked tirelessly to save the company, was nearly wiped from the official history. I wasn't angry, not yet. I thought perhaps Miles needed the spotlight to rebuild his confidence, to feel like the leader again. I had saved the company for our father, not to chase fame. But then one early quarter morning, I received an internal email from the board. The message was brief and cold. My direct operational authority was temporarily revoked, leaving me only a project oversight role. At the bottom were Miles's signature and a few digital signatures from board members I'd once trusted. The stated reason was curt: restructuring senior leadership for unified control. I understood immediately. Miles had convinced them, and this time he aimed to remove me from the board entirely, in the most legal way possible. I sat silently in my living room, staring at the email, feeling the floor collapse beneath me. My brother, the one I'd helped, had turned against me, pushing me out of the company I'd saved. I wasn't entirely surprised, but I hadn't expected him to go this far. I closed my laptop, stepped onto the porch, and gazed at the mist-shrouded collegiate peaks. In that moment, I thought of my father, of the family photo on his desk. I wondered how he'd feel knowing the son he'd placed his hopes in had betrayed the brother who sacrificed for the family. What Miles didn't know was that I'd anticipated this. When I decided to invest in Hartwell Minerals, I didn't just pour in money. I'd worked with Graham Porter, our father's trusted lawyer, to draft a special share agreement. It stipulated that if Hartwell Minerals successfully restructured within 3 years and achieved a certain profit threshold, my ownership would automatically convert to controlling shares. This agreement was signed alongside the investment contract, notarized and stored in the Hartwell family's trust bank. I hadn't told anyone, not even Miles. It was my final card, not for power, but to protect our father's legacy. I'd seen this coming. During the restructuring, I'd established a share trust agreement with the veteran employees who'd been loyal to our father. They entrusted their voting rights to me, not for power, but out of loyalty to the values our father left behind. As a result, when Miles thought he held the majority, I actually controlled over half the votes, not through deceit, but through trust. I didn't reveal this immediately. I let Miles bask in his smugness, let him revel in his false spotlight. I wanted to see how far he'd go, to test if a man's heart could change. Each interview he gave, each claim he made was a small stab at my trust, but I remained patient as my father had taught me. Don't rush, Owen. Time will give you the answers. Then the day came. Miles announced an extraordinary shareholders meeting to set a new strategic direction and remove those no longer suitable. I knew he was targeting me. I received the invitation, accompanied by a polite smile from Miles when he called to confirm. You'll be there, right, Owen? This is a big turning point for the company. His voice was smooth, but I heard the smugness in it. I nodded over the phone, keeping my emotions in check. I'll be there. I prepared in silence. I contacted Graham Porter, reviewing the share agreement and trust documents. I met with the veteran employees who'd stood by my father, receiving their firm nods of support. On the day of the shareholders' meeting, the conference room at Hartwell Minerals headquarters was thick with tension. The shareholders sat upright, their eyes fixed on Miles, who stood at the podium confident as a general. He presented his plan for a second restructuring, emphasizing the need for unified leadership. We need a single leader, he said, glancing at me. Someone with the vision to take Hartwell Minerals further. I sat in the front row, silent, hands clasped tightly. I knew my moment was coming. When Miles proposed a resolution to consolidate leadership, a polished way of ousting me completely, I stood up. The room fell silent. I nodded to Graham, who stepped forward with a stack of documents. Before we vote, I said, my voice calm but clear, I'd like to present something. Graham opened the file and read aloud the special share agreement. He explained that, based on the company's record profits over the past 2 years, my ownership had automatically converted to controlling shares. He presented the trust documents, proving my alliance with the veteran employees, which held over 55% of the shares. The room was stunned. Miles stood frozen, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. He tried to speak, but his voice faltered. I looked straight at him, not with anger or triumph. Miles, I said, I'm not here to compete. I'm here to protect what Dad left behind, from anyone's arrogance, including yours. There was no applause, no cheers. Only a heavy silence and the shareholders' gazes shifting from shock to respect. I left the meeting, leaving Miles standing alone with his defeat. I felt no joy, no satisfaction, only a deep sadness. The sorrow of a younger brother who'd hoped his sibling would change. I stepped outside, the Denver sunlight hitting my face, but my heart was heavy. I had won, but the cost was a fracture in the Hartwell family that could never be mended. The weeks that followed were tense at Hartwell Minerals. Miles, though stripped of operational control, showed no intention of giving up. In a desperate move, he made one final play. He secretly contacted a private investment group in New York, offering to sell a portion of his shares to raise capital for a new company. He believed that with the money he could start over and prove he was still a leader. But he didn't know the investment group was under investigation for financial fraud. When regulators caught wind of the transaction, Miles's shares were frozen. He was sued for transferring legally bound assets, and to cover legal debts, he was forced to sell his remaining shares. The buyer? Me. I didn't want it to come to this. I didn't want to see Miles lose everything. But he had dug his own grave, and I only did what was necessary to protect Hartwell Minerals. When the transaction was finalized, I became the sole legal owner of the company. Standing in my father's old office, I looked at his portrait on the wall, his eyes seeming to follow me. I had saved the company, but I felt no triumph, only an emptiness, the void of a younger brother who had lost the sibling he once loved. With Hartwell Ridge, I decided to do something greater. I expanded the farm into a nature reserve, naming it the Walter Hartwell Reserve. It was more than an eco-lodge. It became a space to protect the land and forests. I hired environmental experts, developed educational programs for local children, and turned Hartwell Ridge into a symbol of sustainability. Each time I stood in the fields listening to the wind whistle through, I could almost hear my father's voice. Wealth can be lost, but honor must be preserved. Miles disappeared from Denver after the lawsuit. I didn't reach out to him, not out of anger, but because I didn't know what to say. He had chosen his path, and I couldn't pull him back. But deep down, I still hoped that one day he would look back and realize that honor, not power, was what our father wanted us to hold on to. 2 years have passed since that day, and under my leadership, Hartwell Minerals has found a steady rhythm. The company not only recovered but became one of Colorado's model mining enterprises. I implemented international standards for every new mining project, ensuring they delivered profits while protecting the environment and creating jobs for thousands in the mountain regions. Each time I visited the mines, I saw workers laughing, families finding hope through stable employment. I felt my father's legacy, not just in numbers but in the eyes of those we helped. I still live in my small log cabin in Buena Vista, still drive my old pickup truck, still tend the garden out back where my mother's flowers bloom every spring. The peace of this place is the greatest reward after all I've been through. Though I'm now a millionaire, I don't want to stray from this way of life. I don't need mansions or supercars. Each morning I brew coffee, sit on the porch, watch the collegiate peaks shimmer in the sunlight, and feel my heart lighten. That's how I remain Owen Hartwell, not the head of Hartwell Minerals, but Walter's son. I've used a portion of the company's profits to sustain the Walter Hartwell Foundation. The foundation awards scholarships to students in geology and mining engineering, builds homes for mining workers, and supports impoverished mountain communities. Each thank you letter from a student or family feels like seeing my mother's smile, my father's proud gaze. I don't do this for praise. I do it to keep my promise to my father, to use wealth to create value, not to flaunt it. Local media began calling me the mountain soul of Colorado, the guardian of the land and my father's honor. I read those articles, but don't let them sway me. I don't chase power or fame. I only want to live by what my father taught me. Integrity is the foundation of every legacy. Business magazines dubbed me the quiet heir, but to me that title doesn't matter. What matters is that each day, standing before my father's portrait in the office, I can look into his eyes and know I haven't let him down. Meanwhile, Miles's life spiraled into an abyss. I heard he moved to Astoria, Oregon, living in a small rented house by the coast, far from New York's glamour. His wife, once accustomed to Manhattan's lavish lifestyle, grew distant, worn down by their financial struggles and the pitying glances of neighbors. I learned this through a mutual acquaintance who said Miles had become withdrawn, often drinking, rarely leaving the house. Miles tried to find work at a small investment consulting firm in Oregon, but no one wanted to hire someone tainted by scandal and failure. Eventually, he took on freelance consulting gigs to scrape by. I thought of him, of our childhood days running around the Cherry Creek house when our mother was alive and our father still smiled. I wondered what had driven us so far apart, what had turned Miles into someone willing to sacrifice everything for power. One September afternoon, I sat in Hartwell Minerals' new office, looking out at the snow-capped collegiate peaks. On my desk, I placed the old family photo, the one my father kept for years, showing the four of us in front of the Cherry Creek house. I looked at Miles in the picture, the boy with a confident smile, and wondered if he still remembered those days. I took a small card and wrote a few lines. "I'm sending you this photo. Though everything has changed, I believe Dad would still want to see us both there, like before." I packaged the photo and card and sent them to Astoria. I didn't expect a reply, but I wanted him to know that despite everything, I still considered him family. In Astoria, Miles received the package on a rainy afternoon. He opened it, finding the photo and my note. I wasn't there, but I imagine him sitting quietly, staring at the picture for a long time. Perhaps he saw our mother's gentle smile, our father's resolute gaze. Perhaps he saw me, the shy younger brother who once hid behind him. And perhaps in his eyes there flickered a regret too deep for words. I don't know what he thought, but I hope even just a little he understood there was still a chance to start over, not to reclaim power, but to rediscover himself. I left the office and drove back to Buena Vista. I stopped at the Walter Hartwell Reserve, where trails winding through pine forests and meadows now drew hundreds of visitors each year. Standing in the valley, looking toward the mountains, I felt an unfamiliar peace. The wind carried the scent of earth and an echo like my father's voice. "You've done well, Owen." I smiled, needing no witnesses. There was no applause, no loud glory. Just me, a man quietly walking through a sunset field carrying the legacy of a lifetime. I know I've kept my father's words, not through strength or cunning, but through perseverance, patience, and integrity. On the office wall, beneath my father's portrait, I had a small plaque engraved, "Integrity builds legacy." It's not just a reminder for me, but for everyone who steps into Hartwell Minerals. That true value lies not in wealth or power, but in how we live and what we leave behind. One late winter afternoon, I decided to return to the villa in Evergreen, where my father had spent his final years. The winding road to the house was the same, snaking through snow-draped pines, but today it felt different. Perhaps because I was no longer the quiet son visiting his father every weekend, but a man carrying the legacy of an entire generation. I stepped inside. The air was cold but familiar, enveloping the space. I still paid for weekly cleanings to keep the house from falling into neglect. Everything was almost exactly as it had been when my father was alive. The walnut desk still neat, the large window still facing Evergreen Lake, where wisps of white mist drifted lazily over the still water. I sat in my father's chair, resting my hands on the desk, feeling the wood's grain as if touching memories. I began sorting through the drawers, a task I'd put off for too long. Old papers, pencils my father once used, and a few faded photos emerged. Then I saw it, a small brown envelope tucked beneath a stack of documents. In my father's familiar, firm yet gentle handwriting, it read, "To Owen, when you read this letter, I believe you're ready to understand what I couldn't say in life." My heart pounded. I opened the envelope and pulled out a neatly folded sheet of paper. My father's voice seemed to echo in my mind as I read each line. "Owen, I know you've wondered why I left most of the estate to your brother, while you received only a barren farm and an old house. I didn't do this because I loved Miles more, but because I understood you both. Miles has spent his life trying to prove his greatness, while you've always shied away from the world. One needed to learn humility, the other needed to learn to believe in himself. I believed that by placing each of you where you feared to tread, you'd discover your true selves. Miles needed your strength, and you needed my faith. That farm isn't just land, it's the true legacy, patience, integrity, and the value of hard work. If you hold on to those, you'll have everything. And if one day the company falls into your hands, remember, don't let power consume your soul. Wealth can be lost, but honor must be preserved." Walter Hartwell. I sat in silence for a long time, the letter heavy as 1,000 pounds in my hands. Each sentence, each word illuminated the journey I'd been through, from a quiet son on the fringes of the family to the man carrying my father's legacy. I thought of the days caring for him in Evergreen, the nights by his hospital bed, and the moment I stood up in the shareholders' meeting, defending Hartwell Minerals from Miles's arrogance. Every step, every decision had been part of my father's vision. He hadn't been unfair. He'd chosen to teach us through silence and challenges, letting Miles and me find our own paths. I folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and tucked it into my coat pocket. I looked out at Evergreen Lake, where the late winter sunset gilded the water. My father had been right. Miles needed to learn humility, but his ambition had overshadowed family. And I, who once thought I wasn't strong enough to lead, had found faith through the challenges my father set. Hartwell Ridge wasn't just land. It was a lesson in patience, integrity, and the value of labor. And Hartwell Minerals, which I'd thought belonged to Miles, became my responsibility. Not to seize, but to protect. A week later, I returned to Hartwell Minerals' new headquarters in Denver. I had my father's words from the letter engraved on a bronze plaque and placed it at the main entrance. "Wealth can be lost, but honor must be preserved. Walter Hartwell." Every day, employees paused to read it, and I saw respect in their eyes, not just for my father, but for the values he left behind. It was a reminder that before building wealth, we must learn to be human. A television interview was held shortly after. The host, a woman with a professional smile, asked, "Mr. Owen, what's your greatest success in life?" I looked into the camera, thinking of my father, my mother, Miles, and the long journey I'd traveled. I smiled and said, "I don't think I'm more successful than anyone else. I just never forgot what my father taught me, and I tried to live in a way that would make him proud." The host nodded, but I knew she couldn't fully grasp the weight of my words. To me, they weren't just an answer. They were a promise I'd kept through the years. My father taught me that a true father doesn't leave behind money, but principles to live by. Through the challenges he set, I learned that integrity and patience are the only things that can't be taken away. Miles, in his pain, learned a harsh lesson about the true value of honor and family. When ambition outstrips love, all that remains is emptiness. I realized the true heir isn't the one chosen in a will, but the one who upholds the family's values even when everything else is lost. My father left me not just Hartwell Ridge, not just Hartwell Minerals, but a lesson in character and resolve. And I, through my way of living, have passed that lesson on. Through the Walter Hartwell Foundation, the Walter Hartwell Reserve, and every decision I've made at the company. One early spring morning, I stood before Evergreen Lake, sunlight glinting off the calm water, sparkling like fragments of memory. I smiled softly, whispering as if to myself, "I understand now, Dad." In that moment, I felt my father's presence, not in the villa or the office, but in the wind, the water, the Colorado land he loved. Walter Hartwell's legacy wasn't the company or the wealth. It was a lesson in how to live, a lesson I'd learned and would carry for life. I left the lake and got into my truck, my heart lighter than ever. The story of me and Miles, of Hartwell Minerals, of our parents, didn't end with applause or loud glory. It ended in quiet, in the peace of a man who'd found the true meaning of legacy. As I drove back to Buena Vista, warm spring sunlight streaming through the window, I knew I'd done what my father wanted: to live rightly, love truly, and hold on to honor no matter how